Hello and welcome to Deprogrammed with Keri Smith. I'm your host, Keri. Today's interview is with a Canadian. There's been some interesting news out of Canada. So just today I saw some stuff. So hopefully we'll get to talk about that. I'm very excited for my guest. His name is Russell. He's the host of the Canadian Conservative podcast. And he's been very patient getting this scheduled. So thank you, Russell. Please welcome to Deprogrammed.
Thank you very much, Keri, for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Cool. I mentioned by the time this airs, this won't be news from today, but I saw some more wacky stuff in the news from your country this morning, and we can talk about that at some point. But before we go there, can you just tell people a little bit about yourself and what is the Canadian Conservative podcast?
My name is Russell, and in 2019, I decided to start a podcast, and it was under a different name at the time. And at the time, I was just interviewing local business owners that were affected by COVID, kind of getting their story. And then I realized over time that looking at the stats, people seem to be most interested in my political commentary. So I rebranded the show. I started having more guests on the show that were more politically motivated, I'd say. I've had Mark Friesen on. I've had Maxime Bernier on. I've had Mark Emery on. So I've had several different interesting personalities on the show. And over time, again, I'm just a one-person show, no background in media really whatsoever. I mean, I wrote for my college newspaper a couple of times freelance, but no real background. So just making it up as I go and trying to make it happen. It's all been an interesting journey so far.
Yeah. What compelled you to start speaking, to start doing a podcast?
Well, everyone that I've known throughout my whole life has said that I always have an opinion on things, and I certainly like to speak my mind. And although I've never really done it in the public sphere, around 2019, late 2019, just before everything hit the fan, my mother, she was in the hospital, and I watched her die right in front of me, and I watched her choke to death on her own lung fluids, and it kind of made a realization for me. I kind of had to reevaluate my life, my priorities, and I decided, you know what? I can speak my mind. There's a free market out there. I can throw my ideas out there, and maybe people listen, maybe they don't. It doesn't matter, and so I just kind of, I guess, watching that kind of gave me the courage to say that I only have one life, and I have to make the best of it and do what I want in that life, and I can't always just do what other people expect from me. And criticism, I mean, there's critics everywhere. I've been, people have messaged me, and I've gotten all sorts of lovely comments from people and that, but for the most part, it's been very positive. And yeah, it's been a journey. It's been a lot of fun so far.
Yeah. One of the best hate mails I got was someone trying to scare me, and they said, "I'm in your house right now." And I didn't think of it until later, but I should have said, "Well, can you do the dishes?" So something you said there about just so uh, traumatic, this trauma, I would imagine, that you went through when your mom passed away. Do you think that sometimes people have to go through something like that to come out on the other side like stronger and um, more courageous in terms of how they're going to spend the rest of their life?
Well, no one grows from comfort, Keri.
Yeah.
No one has ever truly grown from a comfortable place. They have to be challenged, and that was a challenge for me. I had to watch that occur. I had to see that happen, and it changes you. There was a book, Chuck Palahniuk, I think he wrote, what was the name of the book? I'm trying to remember. um I think it was Diary, was the one where he he wrote about the woman that drew the perfect painting, and she was on an island with these occultists, and the whole purpose of the book was talking about how artists drew their best masterpieces when they were suffering the most. And I found that a very compelling short novel at the time when I read it.
Yes. In the past few years, it's something I've thought about a lot, just uh, in terms of individuals and also society at large, going through a struggle for a purpose, with coming out stronger on the other side. It's sort of an opportunity. Every tragedy, every obstacle, every trial that we have to go through. So, well, I'm glad you're doing your show. So tell people a little bit about, have you always been conservative, and what is the title of your show is the Canadian Conservative Podcast. I would ask, what does conservative mean in Canada? Because the definitions of words are changing every day in this current world that we live in. So,
Well, I would say growing up, I was definitely a lot more left leaning. I think most young people are more left leaning is until they have to start paying taxes and things like that. So yeah, I definitely growing up, I was more liberal. At one point, I even flippantly, I think, called myself a communist at one point, but I didn't even really know what that meant. I hadn't
yeah,
really read any literature. I was just going along with the crowd and that what people were saying. And the more I actually did research into it, the more I was absolutely appalled by the doctrines enforced by communist behavior. um, and yeah, just over time I became more conservative, I think, as I saw what I thought was liberalism off the rails, so to
hmm,
speak. um, Reasonable accommodations for different things became, incessant demands, and I kind of started, I worked minimum wage jobs for a long time, and I worked as a security guard at a Ontario Works, which is kind of the double speak for welfare in Ontario, because no one works.
it's
So that's kind of the funny double speak of the name Ontario Works. And I was a security guard at one of the Ontario Works buildings for a while, and I saw people suffering. I saw lots of different um, situations, and then I had to live in working minimum wage security guard job. I couldn't live in a nice house or anything like that, so I lived near downtown in a place that I could afford. And that was actually interesting because quite a few of the clients I saw at the Ontario Works building were my neighbors. And so my car was broken into all the time. There was violence on the streets quite often. But then you would hear in the media, oh, violence is going down. Things are safer than ever. And so I started to see this real disconnect overall. And I saw this disconnect with labor unions as well. Actually, Holly just did a paper, and that I wrote for Substack, kind of about my experience with trade unions and that. And the garbage strike in Windsor a long time ago now was pivotal for me, because I saw people saying, we're the working class, we're the people that people should care about, in that, but they're not the working class. They're the upper middle class. They're the upper class. They're the, in the communist terms, they're the bourgeoisie of society. They own big homes. They drive nice cars.
hmm,
They got purebred pets. You know, they've got it all. And they're on the picket line and they're saying, we're fighting for our rights, damn it. We're not going to take this anymore. And I'm like, take what anymore? I make
yeah,
$10.25 an hour. You make $34 an hour. Really?
yeah,
And I wasn't buying it. And I saw this big disconnect in society where I was hearing from liberals, we have to care about people. We have to care about socialism. We have to care about these things. And the divide between the actual working class people and these luxury liberals, I like to call them,
yeah.
was a big separation.
Limousine liberals. I've known
Yes.
quite a few. Yes. Um, so b- just tell me a little bit about how you think Canada is different from the States, because I have my own opinions about that, but I've never lived there. But what are some of in this cultural war that we find ourselves in? Like, what are some of the big differences if you're living there rather than in the U.S.?
Cultural differences. I mean, our healthcare system is a big cultural difference, I would say,
Mhm.
but it's not. It's another lie that's perpetuated on a large scale.
What do you mean?
Well, our tax-paying money in Canada, we spend a lot of tax money on healthcare, a lot. And yet, my mother was quite ill, and quite often we had to go to the hospital with her. And yes, we never had to pay for anything, but sometimes we would be waiting in an emergency room for 18 to 20 hours.
Wow.
So at one point, we were pretty sure that she had a fractured hip, and she waited in pain in the waiting room for like 14 hours. I had to miss work, so I had to call in sick at work. And of course, my work at the time didn't have benefits, sick leave benefits. So yeah, I had to forego a day's wage to sit in the emergency room until she was eventually seen. They gave her some painkillers. She was already addicted to painkillers at the time, because of them. So they gave her some additional painkillers, told her to go home, and they book her in for an exam. That was their
Wow.
thing.
That's an
Um,
unbelievable amount of time to wait for something like that.
well, I'll tell you something about our healthcare here. You're more likely, if you have a serious illness, to die waiting for treatment. Though you'll get treatment, but you better hope that you can live along the way. My friend Maria, she is dead now, and she is dead because of our Canadian healthcare system. Um, she started feeling numbness in one area of her body, so she went to the doctor. The doctor basically said, "That's not a big deal, not a big deal." She went back again because it was getting worse. So then they booked her in for an MRI. That took about 5, 6, 7 months for her to get. She got the MRI. They confirmed that she had a small tumor in her brain, that was growing. And by the time anyone actually started to take her case seriously, the tumor had grown so big that they were unable to operate, and they put her in palliative care, and she died a year later.
Wow.
She went back home to South America, and the doctors there were appalled. I talked to her. The doctors down there were appalled. They said, because they took a look at her complete file, and they said, when they first detected this, if they had gotten you in right away, they could have done the surgery and you could have lived a normal life. But
But
our
it's
healthcare
right.
system sentenced her to death.
That's incredible. I think these kind of stories, there are a lot of people on the left here in the States who, as you can imagine, speak very highly and I think naively about how they wish our healthcare was like Canada, but they don't hear these kind of stories. Our media doesn't talk about this, about the downsides. It's always the good intent of, right? Like, it sounds great.
Mhm.
Let's just have the government pay for all of your healthcare. Everything should be free. And nobody's talking about, well, that might be a good idea, a good intent, but what are the consequences? How does it play out?
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the left doesn't, because of the way our media is so, uh, it's such an echo chamber based on where you're at on the political spectrum, that people don't even hear stuff like that.
Well, I mean, I watched Michael Moore's documentary talking about Canada's healthcare system. Actually, I believe that Windsor, Ontario, was actually featured in that, if I remember, and I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I watched that propaganda. But he brought some people to Canada where they got their prescriptions filled right away, or something like that. It was a long time ago. It was one of his documentaries, and in some ways, I think, with the prescriptions and things like that, Canada might be doing it right in some ways.
Mhm.
Um, you know, it does, when I hear in some cases in the States, people are paying, $300 for insulin and stuff like that. But again, I don't know the healthcare system well enough to really, I don't want to comment something that's widely out of my
Right,
field of,
right.
vision here. So I do hear about stuff like that, but then I think, you know, everything I've seen from the hospitals, if you pay privately in the States, you get excellent quality of care. Um, we've started to expand some private services here in Canada because we have to. The backlogs, the wait logs, the wait lists are so long now that they've had to start doing some private services. So I got an MRI done a couple of years ago, and I paid privately for it out of pocket. And instead of being on a waiting list for 8 months worrying, they brought me in right away. I was there within 2 weeks. They explained all the procedures. They had it was a very, very clean, very upscale facility. I went in, I got that done. And then I thought about it because that's the first time I've used a privatized service. And I thought, well, I've taken my capital and I've paid for a private service, which means that I've gotten the results that I need. And it's also taken my name off the waiting list for
Right.
someone else who is now going to be seen sooner by the public healthcare system.
Right. So you mentioned in terms of, I want to get back to this question about cultural differences. So one is the healthcare system and what people, I guess, expect or what kind of treatment they get. What about the people? Like sometimes I've had, we did a Canada episode once of Kerfefe Break, and I had two of my friends, Canadian friends, come on and just kind of talk about the climate there. And um, I get the sense here in the States, at least if you're in a state like Texas, like I'm in, that there's more of a libertarian spirit here, whereas in Canada, do people seem on the whole, like on average, are people more compliant or more uh, willing to let the government rule them? Or is that
I
is that an overgeneralization?
I think that the government has given us no choice but to be involved in our lives in very intimate ways that I think if people had other options, they would be more willing to take on those options. Some people, of course, I find a deep dive where they love the government, they love everything to do with the Canadian government. Even some conservatives, I found they've kind of married themselves to just government policy and this idea of, well, if I just follow the party doctrine all the time, then they're going to do what's best for me. The problem, I think, between Canada and the States culturally, this is my opinion, is that in Canada, we have completely separated ourselves voluntarily from our political process. And I can hear my friends now disagreeing or rolling their eyes about it. But in the States, people I find are still very civic minded in the States. They call up their representatives, they go and they talk to their representatives. People in the States, in some areas, are more involved in their communities and that. In Canada, I find people complain a lot about their politicians, but they're not getting involved.
Mm.
I saw Dr. Jordan Peterson um, almost a month ago now in Saskatoon, and he said it way more eloquently than I can, because I mean he's a tenured professor and I'm just a
Mm.
small time podcaster. But we're politically apathetic in Canada. That is the biggest cultural difference.
Mm.
We have this power that we've voluntarily handed over to these authoritarian weirdos to make decisions on our behalf because we become too complacent and frankly too lazy. Ask a Canadian, when's the last time they went to their city council meeting or made a representation? When's
Right.
the last time they called their federal MP or wrote to them? Like, if I have an issue, I call my federal MP. She knows who I am. All right. I've called her several times. I've emailed her. I've written to her. She knows who I am, for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm.
My, local town council, um, I haven't actually been to my town council, but I've been to city council in Saskatoon, which is nearby. And I've sat in there during some of their proceedings and I've taken notes and kind of observed things. And if I had, any type of comments I'd like to make, I would apply if I wanted to. I haven't made any, but if I wanted to, I could. But that's being a civic citizen. That is taking an interest in the politics in our community. And it's not only that. People seem to think, well, I should be able to call up, Maxime Bernier or Pierre Poilievre or Justin Trudeau and voice my concerns. But Jordan Peterson said it best. Who are you to just call up these people and voice your complaints? Who, like, what have you done? How have you earned that type of access? And I have to agree, I'm involved in several nonprofits in my community. Some of them involve alleviating the suffering of people and that through various programs and things like that. And I believe in volunteerism and charity work. And I think that more people should be involved in that. But through those activities, I've been able to meet several different high-ranking members of society and voice my concerns and my beliefs to them. So if more people were involved in their communities and taking part in the civic citizenship, they would have more access to talking with these people instead of relying on just, well, I voted, so there, I did my duty. I'm a civic citizen, I voted. Well, it goes a little bit beyond that. So I'm not buying this, this whole BS of, oh, well, I voted and I'm complained on Twitter and I tagged my MP in it. So I'm part of the political process here.
Right. So I often say on this show, my show gets sometimes people who don't watch it regularly but think they know what it's about, they call it a political podcast. And I don't view it as a political podcast. I view it as more of a cultural podcast. But you have an explicitly political podcast, the Canadian Conservative. So, I mean, you really get into the issues. What are some of the most pressing things, in your opinion, that are happening in Canada?
Pressing issues politically in Canada, of course, is our current electoral system. We use a system called first past the post in Canada, and that is how we elect our governments. 2015, the current Liberal Prime Minister did say that they were looking at a different modeling system, that this wasn't working for Canadians. But then when he got in on the exact same margins that the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, got in on, that quickly went out the window. And then when he got called out on it, he said, well, Canadians just aren't interested in that. Well, actually, we kind of are. Out west, I grew up out east. And when I grew up out east, we never heard anything about out west. Like literally, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta could have been a different country. But yet I come out to Saskatchewan, to work. And all we hear about in Saskatchewan is the problems in Ottawa. So it's very interesting cultural dynamic in that regards. Saskatchewan, Alberta, most of Manitoba is very, very conservative, but we have a lower population than the rest of the country. So we have less seats in parliament, which means that all three of our provinces could vote completely conservative. Everywhere else could vote Liberal NDP, and we would not have a majority government. Yeah. And if you don't have a majority government in Canada, you don't really have a say. Yeah. So there's a lot of different issues. Politically, I think the Conservative Party politically is really suffering right now. They're suffering an identity crisis. The People's Party of Canada is a libertarian offshoot of the Conservatives. They say that they're the true Conservatives, that the Conservatives in Canada have become the liberal lights. And in some regards, maybe they have. In Canada, we as Conservatives, we haven't decided what we want to conserve anymore. What do we want to conserve? What cultural values do we want to conserve? And the problem is that we have so many different brands of conservatism. We have libertarian conservatism, we have classical conservatism, progressive conservatism, fiscal conservatism, and everyone's just fighting amongst themselves. They got this thing where they're just scrapping amongst themselves. And while they do that, the Liberals and the NDP, which is NDP is our far left socialist party, and that they basically just kind of run the show because we're too busy fighting amongst each other over which brand of conservatism is the coolest. And it's become a really, really contentious issue, Keri, in Canada. And Aaron O'Toole, he was the leader of the Conservative Party. He just left. And all these people I know that are conservatives were on his Twitter feed saying, good riddance, get out of here. You're not a real conservative. And that, I mean, Stephen Harper era, which is the previous to Justin Trudeau, he was a conservative. But the problem is Stephen Harper and that was an excellent fiscal conservative. And how did they get and manage government for so long? They basically put a moratorium on any social issues whatsoever. Fiscal, fiscal, fiscal. Well, politics is downstream from culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so while conservatives kept their mouths shut on social issues, the liberals went to town on that. And that's where they keep beating conservatives. The biggest issue, of course, they always bring back is abortion. And that is a very contentious issue for Canadian conservatives. And it's in the Conservative Party of Canada's, not constitution, the kind of their guiding document per se. I've read it over a few times, and it says that conservatives in Canada do not support sex selective abortion. Yet when they went to try to do something in Parliament over it, to pass a bill over it, a lot of conservatives voted against that bill because they don't want to open up the issue. But the
Why
thing
not?
is, because they've let themselves get, I don't know what the term is, cornered on the issue, where because that's what the liberals use as an attack. Listen, you put a conservative government in
Okay.
there, they're coming for your abortion rights.
Okay.
All right. They're going to make, this is Handmaid's Tale. All right. We have Margaret Atwood in Canada. Right. So they start preaching about the Handmaid's Tale. And all sorts of other stuff. You know, they're coming for your abortion rights. And after that, interestingly enough, then they're coming for the gay rights and they're coming for this and all that sort of
They
thing.
do that same, they use it as a hammer here in the States too, that cultural issue. You know, what's interesting, since you mentioned Margaret Atwood, I'm a huge fan of Margaret Atwood. In college, I got to take a whole course on her. So I got to read my favorite author for credit. It was great. And that book, this is just a side note for anyone who's listening. If you think you know what that book's about, but you haven't read it, I don't care whether you're conservative, liberal, leftist, whatever, just read it, because it's what they're doing with that television show and making it this huge cultural phenomenon is, in my opinion, they've taken the book and they've completely missed the point of the book, and they're trying to use it as a hammer against conservatives in the West, and that's not really what that book is about. And it's been misused. And the first season of that show, it stuck to the book pretty faithfully, although they did try and use it to get a bunch of digs in at current political figures. But after the first season, it's just a complete social justice fever dream. Like, it has nothing to do with what she wrote at all.
Well, you got to get the message across, right? The message has to be there. It has to be number one. We got to pump up those ESG scores.
Yes.
Rookie numbers.
Yeah. So are you ever, given the state of things in Canada, are you one of these people who's considering moving, or are you Canada for life?
Well, at one point in time, I thought about moving to Florida.
Mm-hmm.
I was
That's
like,
that's where some Canadians I know are going.
Yeah. I saw. I think it was Viva Fry went there. I think.
Oh, he did. Okay.
I'm not sure. I could be wrong, but I do believe he moved to the States. But I know a few expats and a couple of people that are in the process of moving. I think at this time I'm going to stay in Canada. It's interesting. It's getting weird out here, and weird is always cool to me. I kind of like, I know it's, for a conservative, it's funny. I just sometimes I see these situations and I'm just, I use, for example, a month ago, I went to Saskatoon City Council and we were covering inclusive bathrooms was the topic. And these people walked in, they just had like the craziest outfits, like, leftists and people that follow the Marxist queer ideology and that. And I just thought, like, am I on a TV show or something like that? Like, it just doesn't seem real until you're there. And then you realize, no, this is reality. There's people, this is how they dress every single day. This is how they behave every single day. This is their emotional and mental depth. And then it almost seems like it's a parody of reality.
Yes. It absolutely does. I want to show you something I saw today.
Oh boy, I know what you're going to show me. I can't
Yeah.
wait. Yeah.
So this is a press conference for anyone who hasn't seen this yet. And it was a press conference of a particular political party, is that right?
So what happened here is that the provincial, not the federal, so basically the state equivalent of government, a fringe party known as the New Democrat Party in Ontario. I say fringe because I think they only have 6 seats in currently. They held this like big press conference where they brought out every Batman villain and Lord of the Rings
Yeah.
rogue extra and that to it was you know what, I'll say this, it was a very inclusive press conference. They they had, you know, this lady in a wheelchair and that, and I was like, you know, you just hit your ESG score there, you got to get the person with the disability in there. And you know, and it's a mockery in a way because they hold no institutional power.
Okay.
So they're going to put forward this private members bill. It's going to get shot down, hopefully. I mean, well, they supposedly have a conservative government in provincially in Ontario, but that's a whole other story we could get into with Doug Ford and that. But basically, yeah, this press conference, it was quite something. If they thought this was going to get people onto their side, I mean,
yeah,
the
just
people
visually,
that
it's stunning. I'll say, I shared here on the screen. You can see I shared this image because it's this. If you're just listening and not watching, it's this. It's a literal Joker-looking Batman villain figure with multicolored crazy clown hair, like green and orange streaked hair, drag queen makeup, like huge villainous eyes and lips, and black and white Beetlejuice kind of outfit. And then behind, you just see this cast of characters that are wearing masks. And it looks like, I put here just a silly quote, a quote from one of the Batman movies. You know, see, this is how crazy Batman's made Gotham. If you want order in Gotham, Batman must take off his mask and turn himself in, because it looked like the Joker giving a press conference. But one of the things I heard they talked about, maybe this is related to what you're saying, is that they want to make it illegal, because I saw Billboard Chris, who's based in Canada. They want to make it illegal for people like Chris to protest outside of drag shows, drag performances for children, to exercise your free speech rights, which I guess are a little different there in Canada anyway, because you don't have the First Amendment.
Well,
Uh,
I'll give some
yeah.
context to this, Keri. So what's happened is that the cultural phenomenon of drag queens. Now, I've been to drag shows in the past. I've been to drag bingo and that. And it's
And
always
you
featured.
yourself are a gay man. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I was at a bar one time and I watched a drag queen basically consume drugs off of another person and that. You know, I've watched, you know, in the past, I don't watch anymore, of course, because I've become so disgusted by this whole thing. And I'm very big on you do you. You know, people, you know, if they're adults, there's all sorts of different stuff out there. You know what? Maybe I go to the chess club and that's not high speed, low drag for some people. Some people do base jumping. Some people revolve their identity around dressing up as the opposite sex and doing you know, shows about it and that. Everyone's got their thing. And
I was in the chess club.
I was too. I sucked at it, so that's why I took up backgammon, because it's
Okay.
way more luck based. I love it. But yeah, it's, you know, I'm very big on this whole, you know, there's a free market of ideas out there. There's a, you know, it's an open market, and people will go where their interests lie, and then they'll spend their money in those areas,
Yes.
and they'll have
Yes.
their industry. Um, no problem with it whatsoever until they started doing drag stuff with kids.
With kids.
And
Absolutely.
And I've been told, well, what about the church? And I'm like, well, what about the church? Everyone's known about the scandals in the church for years. The church is taking active steps to try to quell it. They're taking steps to try to make up for historical wrongs. Actually, maybe your community can take a lesson from the church of what happens when you just allow unrestricted access.
Yep.
Without taking proper measures. So maybe take a lesson from the church so that doesn't happen. And when they say the church, it's always the Christian church, it's always the Catholic church. It's not, they never cover anything to do with any abuse that might be happening in the Islamic faith, or the Jewish faith, and that it's a big attack on Christianity, because Christians, we like to take turn the other cheek pretty on the nose these days, and that.
Yeah.
So
They also, I think it's just, there's something so deceitful and disgusting about that argument, because what they're doing, when we're saying, hey, we shouldn't be having sexually inappropriate, sexually explicit performances for children, and then they say, well, because this awful thing happens in this other place, and there's child abuse, sexual abuse in the church, why not have it over here? What kind of argument is that anyway? It's bad in the church too. I don't even get that argument.
Well, and they're force teaming people as well. Yeah. Well, you're against this, so you're obviously a Christian, you're obviously a far-right Nazi bigot, blah, blah, blah. Right. Words have no meaning anymore because we've taken all the meaning and just evaporated it into thin air. So yeah, I had no issue at all with drag shows. I've been to a few, not really my thing, but again, my friend group at the time, they went, and so, I went with them, and certainly it's weird. You go out there, you see stuff, and you're just like, okay, well, this is reality. This is what's really going on, I guess. And then I see the stuff, and again, it probably wouldn't even be that contentious if it was a true pantomime, because they try to say, well, these drag queens, it's equivalent to clownery. Well, clowns go to school and they're vetted and they have extensive background checks done on them, because they are going to be, their primary audience is children. So
and they're not stripping and waving their genitalia in the faces of children like we've seen at some of these shows.
Well, and that's kind of the problem. The other thing too, if this was just, what they call like a missed out fire type thing, I don't even think you'd have people that would be upset about it but we have the videos, we have the pictures. You can't tell us to deny reality. We've seen it, and it's not appropriate. And so, when you start, someone will say, well, what's your problem? You're just transphobic. Or, well, number one, drag queens are not transgender. And that the majority of drag queens are gay men that are performing a woman face. So drag queen and transgender, that's two completely separate topics that they've conflated into one. Yes, some drag queens are transgender, but the vast majority are gay men that are dressing up in woman face, and doing a cultural facade of what they believe a woman is in the first place.
It's entertainment. It's adult entertainment. And I used to produce drag and burlesque shows. Like, in my old life, part of my career was doing that. I was at drag shows all the time. They are adult content, just like the burlesque shows, just like strip clubs. Like, and it blows my mind that we're at this place now where they're pretending like it's made for children. Do you mind if I play just a clip of this press conference? Because I want to get your take on what they're doing here. I think what they're doing is a Mott and Bailey, but I want to see what you think about it.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, let's see. I think I've got it up here.
We will not let fear win. A world without trans people has never existed. A world without drag has never existed, and it never will. Queer people have always been here amongst us. They are our coworkers, they are our brothers, our sisters, they are our mothers, our fathers, they are our families. Drag is art, drag is culture, drag is educational, drag is creative, drag is comedy, but drag is not a crime. My name is Scarlett Bobo, and thank you so much for your time. We will.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, Keri. So here's my thing, my take on that. No one is trying to ban drag.
Correct.
No one is trying to, the problem with something like this is they mix in a little, the best lies are the ones that have a little bit of the truth mixed in with it. That can make it, you have to start to get in the weeds and extrapolate the truth from the lie. This press conference is a farce. No one is trying to ban drag queens. No one is trying to, get rid of, the differing personalities that exist out there that don't conform to the normal societal expectations and norms. No one is trying to, put on the Truman Show where everyone's going to act a certain way within their roles. There's no expectation of that. And frankly, it goes against the free market principles. And that what this is right here is it's a lie that has a little bit of truth wrapped up into it. Yes, is it cultural? Sure, within certain communities it is cultural. Is it comedy? Well, yeah, that's what the hell is RuPaul's Drag Race? It's a comedy show. And that what people are opposed to is the fact that we have videos out there that clearly showcase that there are drag performers that are doing inappropriate sexualized dances. We have parents that are giving their kids money to go put in the drag queen's thong and that. If I brought a 10-year-old to a strip club, number one, I should never be allowed in. But number two, and I gave them money to put in the stripper's thong, I would hope that not only would we get booted out, the police would be called, Child Protective Services would be called, and I would hope that the stripper would stop performing and say, get this child out of here. This is not appropriate. This is not why I'm here. Yes. This is not within my job. So there's a lot of blame to go around here. Number one, the kids don't get there on their own. Woke wino wine mommy is bringing them there, and they're taking selfies with the drag queen and the kid for Instagram likes, for status amongst their peers. All right. That way, when they show up next week for half price appies and wine and that with their Munchausen by proxy friends. All right. And they can say, look how woke I am. Look how amazing I am. See, I'm down with the cause. I'm down with the cause, Oh, and my son Johnny, I saw him with the dress the other day. I think it's time to book the surgery. That sort of thing, right? And maybe I'm being a tad bit hyperbolic as well, but it's
based in truth. I've seen these groups. I'm in a lot of the groups of they're called things like parents of transgender kids, and there is an excitement there amongst these leftist moms, an excitement about the fact that their child might be trans. I put that in quotes, and it becomes a part of their identity. It's fascinating. Somebody should be studying these groups as a form of I don't know, group psychosis or something. It's terrifying, but it's also fascinating.
Well, it is terrifying because they've co-opted the psychological industry. They've co-opted the medical industry into it. They've made drag queens, which was a niche area, into a societal phenomenon.
Yeah.
And now they have the gall to be outraged when there's cultural pushback. How could there be cultural pushback against it? It's just us drag queens. No big deal, right? Like, we're not doing anything wrong. And here's the thing. I do believe that the majority of the drag queens that do the performances, drag queening is not a big money maker. I don't think it's a big money maker overall. So I think these people see the money and they see the opportunity to get their name out there because they all want to be on the famous drag race shows. They want to be on Canada's Drag Race. They all want to be like, that's where they want to go. That is their career progression, is to get on the national stage and get 1 million Instagram followers and get their sponsors. No different than, any vlogger or podcaster out there. That's the ultimate goal, right? Mm-hmm. Is to produce content that's going to draw people in and draw money in.
Mm-hmm.
But when they show up there and there's an audience full of kids, they're taking a look and they're saying, well, I got to make money. I got to pay the bills and that. So, it becomes a moral principle versus money. Well, you and I both know the vast majority of the time, money takes precedence over morals and that.
Yes.
Vast majority of the time. So there's blame to go around. Blaming the parents for, this helping with this, blaming the media for promoting it, blaming the drag performers themselves. They have a little bit of blame to go around. They show up, and I mean, we've seen it a few times. We've seen it a few times where, they're doing the performance. There's a child there, and, they got their fake tits hanging out, and then they're covering them up and around the kid and laughing, like, because they want to make their money, but they don't want to be perceived as a pervert.
Yeah.
And that. And I don't think that they're all perverts. I really don't.
No, I don't either. Some of them are just opportunists because of this cultural moment, like you're talking about. And then there's also, I mean, I have a lot of respect for the drag queens like Katie Demure who are coming out and speaking and saying, don't bring your kids to my show. What is wrong with you? Like, get your kids out of here. And there are some drag queens who are doing that.
Yeah, and the industry itself, it's so interesting because when there's a cultural shift, there of course there's the blowback. So now we have Gays Against Groomers, and we have these organizations now that are pushing back against it, and they're making their money now and they're employing people. I find the free market so fascinating. I really do. It's amazing how culture can influence the free market and that. But the difference is, the left right now has the institutional power. They have the power of the media. Yes. They have the power of the politics, but the right continues to fight like they don't have the odds stacked against them. And they, there's a lot of noise on Twitter, for example, but that doesn't really translate to real life in that. When I went to Saskatoon City Council, and I sat there and I watched the proceedings about the inclusive bathroom policy, there was maybe 15 people there that were against the inclusive bathrooms. And then the left, through their nonprofits, they got a whole bunch of students there. They got a whole bunch of people. They stacked the room, and they probably had 100 people there, maybe a little bit more. And that's pretty big for a small, apathetic Canadian city. Mm-hmm. And so then, I'm saying to myself, okay, well, where are all these conservatives then? Where are all these, people that are outraged? And I hear, well, they're actually at work in that. Well, if it's that important of an issue to you, you'll find the time to make it. You'll find the way to make your voice heard.
Yes.
So it's not an important issue.
What do you think are some of the places in which, speaking of that, the places in which conservatives are failing? Like, what could they do differently to make? I have some ideas, being someone who was on the left for so long and who now has come to understand some of the conservative positions better. But what are your ideas on, like, how can they mobilize people, get people involved and interested?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you. And that's because the reason why I don't have a good answer for you is because I've seen attempts. The Freedom Convoy is the perfect example. And it wasn't just a conservative. There was lots of libertarians. There was liberals. There was even NDP members, actually old school socialists that believe in the working class. Like, because the Freedom Convoy was a working class movement. It's funny. The Freedom Convoy to Ottawa did more for Canada than Occupy Wall Street ever did with their months of planning and doomsdaying and doomsaying and that. And then, of course, they showed up in Ottawa, and they're not professional protest organizers, so they just threw a big party in Ottawa and disrupted things. Wow, talk about disruptor. And it upset the liberal order of things. It upset in Ottawa, we call them the Laurentian elites, and that. Because there's a lot of upper class government workers, a lot of lobbyists and big time contractors there. And I mean, they were inconvenienced, and the lower class, the truckers, the security guards, the fast food workers, all these, lower income jobs, people that were out of work, people that were literally, they're divorced. They don't have a house anymore because of these COVID restrictions and that. Our government gave people money that they expected it all to be paid back to them with interest. So some people are going to lose their homes because they got to pay everything back and that. Wow. So they all went to Ottawa. They got there and they're like, well, we don't know what to do. So they just partied it up. I mean, I was really, really, happy to see a couple of my relatives. I was watching some live streams, and that, and I actually saw a couple of my relatives in Windsor and friends and that in Windsor were at the Windsor rally that they did outside the Ambassador Bridge. But it was a shock to the government. I watched the Ottawa City Council meetings online after the Freedom Convoy, and they were screaming at each other, accusing, like, it all fell apart. It all fell apart because the whole system is so fragile, and it's so based on, there's no backup plans for anything. There's no, it's not a hardened-in system. It's not a conservative system. They haven't conserved anything, so there's no fallback. So as soon as anything goes out of their control, it all falls apart. The problem with the Conservatives is after the Freedom Convoy, a whole bunch of people made off like bandits. A whole bunch of people got abandoned overall. My friend from Diverge Media, he's covered a lot of it. And there was talk about government collusion and that sort of stuff. And it's, again, Conservatives have become very conspiratorial in their thinking as well, and for good reason in some regards, and not so good reasons for other regards. And I think, not to get too much into the weeds off our topic here, I think that has a lot to do with everything that happened with Jeffrey Epstein and that sort of thing. And the reason why, if I had told you, Keri, 20 years ago that there was an elite group of politicians and lobbyists and private industry leaders that were flying out to a private island and where they were having sex with little kids and filming it as blackmail on each other, and then they were running a worldwide extortion ring that involved levels of government from both Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, you would have told me I was nuts. You would have told me I was insane. You would have recommended I get checked into a mental health institution.
Yeah.
But then it happened. It happened. It was real. It wasn't fake. It wasn't fake news. It happened. There was a Mongol that was using extortion through people having sex with little kids, and that to exert power and influence.
And they still have power and influence, because we're never going to get that list of names.
What list?
Yeah.
That his girlfriend trafficked a bunch of kids to no one, right? That never, it's just so funny because the power elite, so funny. We're going to hold the power to account. The left hold the power to account. Well, what about Epstein Island and all that? Crickets, nothing, right? Because it's their heroes might be on the list, right? But the Conservatives took the opposite approach. Burn the whole system down. Don't trust anyone. Everyone is a Fed. Everyone's involved in it somehow. And so then they fight amongst each other, and maybe there are some disruptors in there probably. And then the real far right, the actual neo-Nazis and that managed to get their tentacles in there in some places. And that's the problem is conservatives, we've fallen for this conspiratorial thinking. A lot of it's justified. Sure. There's Panama Papers. When they got released, the only person that got any issues from the Panama Papers was the person who wrote it. Died in I believe it was a car crash 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
It's the left and the right. We really got to stop thinking about, in my opinion, just those terms, because the actual people that are ruining our lives, they're not left or right. They say they're voting for liberal and they're voting for conservative. They're voting for themselves. They're voting for their money and their foundations and their operations. I mean, Canada, it hasn't been confirmed, so I don't want to end up getting myself in trouble here, but there's good reason to believe that our last election actually had election interference from China, that there was ridings that have been targeted specifically with Chinese influence and Chinese money, and that they still exert some influence in Canada overall.
And I will have to say here, because you're right, we do live in this censorious age, and YouTube could very well choose to take this video down. So this is alleged. That's all. I'm just going to make that little caveat.
Yeah, and I haven't said that I haven't said either that it is or is not. There's allegations currently from our spy agency that there's several allegations that there are politicians involved in in all sorts of nefarious stuff doing with China and Chinese money influence in Canada. But you talk to any Canadian, they'll tell you that. It's not like it's just like an open secret almost that no one really wanted to talk about until recently. So Conservatives, I mean, I think one of the issues they could win on very easily, we need to steel man our electoral process. Scott Adams said it pretty good before. He said, if you don't trust your elections, do you even have a country?
Exactly.
Couldn't agree with him more. And I feel like that's a good bipartisan win if people actually could get out of their echo chambers for a bit, regardless of what we believe or don't believe. And I have people that are pretty extreme on the libertarian scale that say we're not going to vote our way out of this. Well, we're going to have to, because the option that they think is the option, I mean, there's no coming back from that. That's the nuclear option.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's appropriate either. I'm not an anarchist or a, what they call them. Basically we're like sovereign citizen or anything like
right.
that. I believe in individualism, but I also believe that, if you don't have things like border services and you don't have certain institutions on a federal level, then you can't really claim to have a country.
I agree. Laws. I mean, I've spent a lot of time, I guess, in the past couple of years, talking to some people who are like anarcho-capitalist kind of, and I've thoroughly rejected it. I think it's just as idealistic and stupid, frankly, wrongheaded as Marxism. That's my opinion. It's like it requires this amount of a belief in a utopia and in my opinion, a sort of a deep inability to understand humans and human nature, to think that like, oh, we can just exist in a place with no laws and no government and it'll be cool. And like, yeah,
well, ask how that worked for like the hippie communes where they had to bring in like the military to evac people out because it was so unsanitary and so disgusting. And that, I mean, yeah, it's a nice pipe dream, nice, very hippie-ish, very free love and energy pipe dream and that, but it falls apart as soon as it's put into reality, very similar to any type of communistic ideals.
I agree. I think they're similar in some ways.
But, it's interesting because the communists, the old school communists, it's like we've gone full circle, time is a flat circle type thing in a way, because if you were to talk to an old school worker labor union communist, not these modern day 300-pound hippos and that, but an actual old school workers communist, union, they would tell you that gay rights issues and trans issues and most of these social justice issues, they're all bourgeoisie issues. They're all issues that only quash class consciousness and quash the rights of the people to rise up against their oppressors. And that it's just so funny when I see people, like I've gotten into these arguments with these communists. They told me that's a Stalinist communist ideal, that Marx was better and that sort of thing. And I don't think there's ever been a communist leader that's taken power that's actually been supportive of homosexuals. It's funny, you'll see like these revolutionaries communists and they're wearing the Che Guevara shirt and they're at some pride rally, and I'm like, Che Guevara, like I'm pretty sure I read somewhere he burned homosexuals alive and stuff like that. And
but they don't even know who Che Guevara is. That's the thing.
But they watch Motorcycle Diaries. He's a poet.
Yeah. They don't even know. That's such a great example of what it's like being on the left, I think, because that's where I was at for a while. I had one of the comedians I worked with, we did a whole tour and artwork and stuff that was an homage to Che Guevara without even knowing what we were doing. They just kind of pick up these symbols and they think they have an idea about something, but they don't do the work. To do the work, that's one of their phrases. They don't do the work. Yeah.
Well, and I feel kind of bad too, because when we talk about what conservatives need to do, I in a way I'm almost saying the same thing, that conservatives need to do the work in a way, but I guess what I want to say with the conservative movement is, oh, you can complain about all this leftist institutional stuff and that, but guess what? They showed up. They showed up. We didn't. While they were going to town council meetings and passing resolutions, and while they were, getting, organizing, where they were going to EDA, electoral district association meetings and getting policies in place and using their lobbying power to send to Ottawa to get this sort of stuff put in place, conservatives were on their asses on the couch watching the football game or watching the hockey game. Well, guess what? You sat on the couch watching the hockey game for so long. Now the hockey game, now the big thing is, hockey players wearing rainbow jerseys and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, and I've said again, at the end of the day, it should be up to the individual player. They should be given the option if they want to or not. And if they don't want to, then they don't have to. They don't have to participate in my opinion. They're there to play hockey.
I've seen some of the hockey players are coming out now, and more than one, and saying, I'm not going to wear it.
But they're scapegoating though, Keri. They're scapegoating because they're using, well, my religion says that I don't wear these things, and that this is incongruent with my religious beliefs, which is a good save. But that's still a cop out. That's still
why?
Why
do you think so?
Well, because they're basically saying, if I didn't have my religious beliefs, I would wear the jersey. I'm not saying it because they have they're not saying it because they actually, and they probably do, but they're using religion because you can't discriminate on religious grounds, right?
So that's why they're using it, but I think it might also be true. I mean, it's sort of like the cake baker in the States who's been targeted, it's like, his whole argument was, because of my religious beliefs, I'm not willing to participate in, like, you can have your gay wedding and get your gay cake, but I'm not willing to participate in it by performing a service and actually making the cake for the ceremony because of my religious beliefs. And
100%.
I see what you're saying though, is they're using like during the past 2 years with the COVID mandates and stuff, and some of the employer mandates, there were people using the religious exemption also to say, it goes against, because that's something that is protected.
I think it would be much more impactful if they just said, you know what, this isn't congruent with my personal beliefs, so I won't be wearing the jersey. It's the exact same thing, only they're saying it based on their own personal principles, because again, they put religion into it, and I respect religious rights in Canada, which is why, as I got married in Vegas, by Elvis, and that it was a fun little ceremony.
I was at an Elvis wedding. He does a lot of them.
Yeah, oh yeah, the king lives on in all of us. I was mad. I was pretty intoxicated though, and I was mad because they have a midget Elvis package, and
no,
and I got there too late. I couldn't get the midget Elvis, so it's all good though. It's all good. It was a lot of fun, but I fully respect the Catholic Church, for example, saying that they don't support gay marriage. And when I hear gay people say that the church needs to change, no, the church does not need to change. No. I heard, the Pope said, being gay shouldn't be illegal, but it's still a sin. Couldn't agree more. That is their belief. That's their doctrine. They are entitled to have their doctrine. But yet when the Catholic Church or the Christian faith says something like that, they are pounced on, because again, it's too easy. You said if you tried to do that with the Islamic faith, well, you'd have Charlie Hebdo all over again. All right.
That's why they go after the Christians,
because it's a soft target. It's you even look at this recent, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he's pretty involved in the Catholic Church, and I was telling him, I said, listen, you need to take a page from the synagogues in New York and places like that, and you need to target harden your churches, target harden your Catholic schools, because this isn't going to stop. This is going to make big impact overall. And target harden those areas. Ushers, can't do it in Canada, because in Canada you're supposed to just, instead of defend yourself, you're supposed to smile as you get stabbed to death or shot to death by some thug and that. But in the States, like, all your ushers should all be trained in de-escalation techniques, and then that doesn't work. They should all be concealed carrying.
Yeah.
And my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
And trained in concealed carry and trained in crowd protection and that sort of stuff. Teachers in schools, same thing in Catholic schools. Again, where they say the shooter got shot through a side door window and got in. Well, in the modern era, that should never even been an option. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not putting any blame on the victims at all or the school or anything like that. It's just a modern reality is that there's extremists everywhere, and areas that are vulnerable need to target harden. They do. Yeah. And at the end of the day, the Catholic Church is allowed to say, we don't want homosexual people killed, but we do believe it's a sin. And they just get pounced on for that. And I say, well, why? That is their religious belief. I would never go to Iran and expect that they wouldn't tie me up and throw me off a building.
Mm-hmm.
I would expect that would happen to me. That's why I wouldn't go to Iran. Or if I did, I wouldn't go there waving a rainbow flag anywhere. And that it's reality. It's common sense. It's something we seem to be lacking, in the West, and that the rest of the world still has it.
Common sense has become very uncommon in the West.
Well, yeah. and I have friends from other countries, that I grew up with, and back when I was in grade school, we were taking in a lot of refugees from Yugoslavia, the Bosnia, those areas, Romania, and my best friend growing up was Romanian, and he told me stories about when he was a child, the constant worry from their country and these radical factions. I mean, one of the guys I knew in high school was from Yugoslavia, and he was telling me about how his dad had trained him to use an AK-47 when he was like 6 years old, and he saw someone's arm get blown off with a hand grenade. Wow. That's reality. So then he comes to Canada where our biggest worry is, who's wearing what or whatnot. It's so incongruent with the rest of the world and the reality of people. And, it just showcases, we talk about privilege.
Yeah.
That this is our privilege.
We have the most privilege to be obsessed with and outraged about the most ridiculous things here. And that's a privilege they're never going to talk about, So the West is, I think we're due to take it back to the beginning of the conversation. I think we're due for hard times. That's why we're starting to go through these hard times culturally, because we've become so weak, and just focused on things that don't matter, with the privilege to do so, with the copious amounts of time and things that we take for granted, and survival, just basic. We've become so separated from basic survival and reality, and that's kind of how I view things. Russell, thank you so much for stopping by today. Can you just tell people where they can find you? And you guys, below in the description, you can find all this information and links, but just tell people where they can find you if they want to check out the Canadian Conservative podcast.
I just want to say, Keri, thank you very much for having me on your show today. It's been a blast. I know we've rescheduled a couple of times and that, but it's been a lot of fun. For me, myself personally, you can find me at the Canadian Conservative Podcast on any of your podcasting apps, all that usual stuff. I'm on Twitter as well. That's the only social media I use is Twitter. I don't use any other social media. I don't have a personal social media, and that I try to feed the algorithm as little as possible. And you can find me just at Canadian Conservative Podcast. I think it's at the Canadian Con, which is funny all in itself. But I can't do any more letters than that. And then you can also find me at the CanadianConservative.substack.com. I do some writing, not as much as I should, but I do some writing there.
Cool. And we've got all that below, so you guys check it out. Thank you so much, Russell, for dropping by Deprogrammed. Have a good rest of your week.
You too. Thanks, Keri.
Cool. Thank you.